morning, Darci. We've got Darci Vetter here all the way from the US. And yesterday afternoon, Mario Stetter yesterday morning mentioned that we should listen to your talk. Early morning he mentioned it, and I said to Louise, I didn't go look at even what you do, but if somebody mentions from the stage that you should listen to this person, you probably should. And both Louise and I, we were standing there and gobsmacked about what you told us about, in particular, the US state and how the tariffs and everything work. And why we invited you is to come and explain that in layman's terms for the people that might be listening to this. So thank you for being here. And just do a brief introduction of who you are and your long career.
Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for having me. My name is Darci Vetter. I'm currently an independent consultant. I work with food and agriculture companies primarily, helping them navigate issues of trade policy and sustainability and other issues like that. But the vast majority of my career was spent in the U.S. federal government, first as a civil servant trade negotiator. I worked for a while in the U.S. Senate on the Trade Committee of the U.S., the Senate Finance Committee. But during the Obama administration, I was the Deputy Undersecretary of Agriculture in charge of the Foreign Agricultural Service and International Ag Programs for 4 years, and then became the Deputy U.S. Trade Representative for Agriculture, a role called the Chief Agricultural Negotiator. And I did exactly that, which I led the negotiation of trade agreements on agriculture and the ag sector. At the time, the U.S. was very engaged in the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade negotiation with 12 countries in the Asia-Pacific, and so I led that negotiation for agriculture. Of course, eventually the U.S. decided not to join that agreement after the election of President Trump in 2016. So was disappointing to see, but certainly a really interesting experience for the U.S. and rewarding to see the other countries move that agreement forward.
Is that now for importing and exporting out of the U.S.?
Yes, absolutely. It's negotiating the terms of trade. So tariffs, non-tariff barriers, how to work together on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. So sort of all of those agricultural provisions.
Oh, wow.
So Darci, how you broke down the setup and the way the landscape of tariffs and what has been happening from the United States in the last year was absolutely fascinating and gave us a far clearer understanding of how things are unfolding. And that's why we would love you to share a little bit of that with us today, please.
One of the particular, it just happened to be at the Blueberry Summit. I think we're not exporting any fresh blueberries to the US yet, as far as I know. But we are exporting stone fruit, grape, and citrus, of which citrus is the biggest, if I'm correct. And we've got big programs in South Africa called Summer Citrus from South Africa, and it's all mostly soft citrus and oranges, and there's some grapefruit because it's counter season going into the States. And because of this whole tariff thing, what happened is communities like a small town of Citrusdal, which is from where we're sitting about 3 hours north, is so dependent on that because they've really geared most of their production around that summer citrus program to the US. And it's been incredible for those communities to have the fruit go there, and frankly, they got good prices. But now those communities are really worried that we'll be sending less fruit into the States. So let me give you what I understand, and then I would, if I'm wrong, please correct me. So the person at the end who's going to be paying the premium is not going to be the farmer on the side. It's going to be the consumer buying the item on that side. So what might happen is that a mandarin or orange from Peru, for instance, or Brazil or wherever, might be laying next to each other and it might be cheaper than a South African fruit.
Because of the tariff amount.
Meaning that one might sell first, meaning that less are being bought of our fruit. Am I correct in that?
Yes. I mean, I think one of the one of the misconceptions or one of the messages that's being shared by this administration is that other countries will be paying this tariff.
Yes, yes, yes,
But
yes.
the truth is that the importer pays the tariff, right? And that tariff is due on entry into the United States. Now, in reality, what often happens is, the exporter, in this case, the South African farmers, know that that tariff is going to make their product more expensive. So there might be some agreement between importer and exporter where the exporter agrees to take a lower margin
Okay.
so that price doesn't have to be passed on completely to consumers. But the amount of margin available in a sector like agriculture is small to begin with. And so, the length of time that exporters can offer that and lower their margin and still be viable, how long can a relationship like that last, right? And I think what we have seen in the short term with these tariffs that keep changing and have been implemented quickly is more effort by both the exporter and the importer to try to eat that cost in the short term to maintain their relationship with consumers in the long term, but in hopes that those tariffs will come down or, may not continue. And what I fear is that we're nearing the end of that period, right? Where consumers are really going to start to feel the crunch of tariffs. And it's not just South African product,
Yes,
right? And
yes.
so not to be insensitive, obviously it's painful, right? If you lose what has been a reliable and a lucrative market. So we don't want to see that happen. But if you put yourself in the shoes of the U.S. consumer, where the United States has now put at least 10% across the board tariffs on major partners in agriculture and all consumer goods, those costs are going to start hitting all at once. And, it's particularly worrying to me on things like nutritious food, like citrus, like blueberries, that we cannot in the United States provide out of season, but that every consumer in the United States should be eating more of. And what this price increase will do is simply put them out of reach for the poorest Americans. And, tariffs are taxes, and they eventually will be paid by U.S. consumers. And taxes on food are regressive taxes. It's the poor that spend the most of their income or the biggest percentage of their income on food and will feel the burden of these tariffs most acutely and will probably have much poorer diets because of it. So, I certainly feel for producers who are have been serving that U.S. market, and frankly, in this case, providing something that the U.S. market could not provide is not substitutable. And I feel for U.S. consumers who are trying desperately to make ends meet, and we'll see that everyday basket of goods really start to go up in price. But a big message of this administration, the Trump administration's campaign, and they continue to say it, is that these tariffs are somehow being paid by foreign governments, and not by citrus growers and consumers on the other end. And it's just not accurate. It's, business people and everyday shoppers trying to do the best they can to provide, a healthy diet.
So I think, would you please break down what you told us about the tariffs yesterday of that rule that President Trump is enforcing as a emergency, things like that, and what could come from that? Because I think that was very fascinating.
Yes.
Sure. So, typically the power to tax and spend in the United States lies with Congress in our Constitution. It's referred to as the power of the purse. And typically Congress very jealously guards that power. And, I spent many years in the executive branch, so under the authority of the president, negotiating trade agreements. But I was negotiating them because Congress had delegated that negotiating authority to the president and the president's team at USTR, but with close requirements for consultation with Congress throughout those negotiations and the duty that Congress would ultimately have to approve any trade agreement that was negotiated. And so the ultimate power was retained through Congress, and certainly you couldn't just dump an agreement at the end on Congress's door and say, approve this, please. They had input throughout the process.
Okay.
What we're seeing now is, the broad imposition of tariffs on every country in the world,
And
essentially, and everything. So every product from countries at a base rate of 10%, countries like South Africa facing much higher, 30% tariffs. And you're seeing tariffs on specific products. Products in particular that the United States is trying to provide some protection for domestic industry and to either revitalize manufacturing or protect current manufacturing in those industries.
Which is also understandable.
It is understandable. I think the degree of protection necessary, the amount of damage, typically that needs to be substantiated through an investigation. And some of those investigations are going on now. In fact, this morning, more tariffs on furniture, heavy trucks, and pharmaceuticals were announced today, going into effect in just a few days.
Okay.
But the authority used for those product-specific tariffs, the investigation, the consultation period, the opportunity for comment, those lie in more longstanding trade law. They're being used very expansively, but there's a process that's clear. These across-the-board tariffs that were very quickly put in place, called the reciprocal tariffs, right? The authority for that you referred to before is really one that presidents had not used before to use for tariffs. And it's something called the International Economic Emergency Powers Act. And essentially what that does is gives the president the ability to take economic measures to deal with a national emergency without going to Congress first, because it is, in fact, an emergency measure. In the past, that has been used typically for things like economic sanctions. Sanctions on Iran have gone through IEEPA. Sanctions placed on individuals associated with terrorism, for example, that law has been used to justify them. They have not been used to impose tariffs, and those powers have not been used in such a sweeping way, taking action against essentially every country. And so it really calls into question, one, are tariffs at all, were they envisioned by this law that is decades old? Did they think tariffs were one of the economic powers that's not mentioned in the law itself? And two, what's an emergency that really allows the president to take these actions in such a sweeping way? And I think both are worthy questions, because the emergency that this administration is using is the trade deficit. And the fact that we have a persistent and large trade deficit with the rest of the world as the United States is being cited as the emergency measure here. And there are a lot of people, myself included, who would say, is this an emergency? We've had this for a long time. It is a long-term persistent problem. Is an emergency measure really the appropriate way to deal with it?
Sorry, if I may ask quickly before you, Karen.
Sure.
Is this IEEPA rule, is it only in the US or is it the international rule?
Oh, it's a U.S. law. I
Okay.
think a number of countries probably have provisions to take emergency actions or measures, but this is, in fact, an act in U.S. law that gives those sort of temporary extraordinary powers to the president. Now, under IEEPA, after a period of time, the president is required to go back to Congress and say, here's the data, here's what's happening and why we consider that an emergency, and ask for sort of Congress's concurrence with that emergency. In normal times, with such a broad trade measure as we're seeing, Congress probably would have said well before that 6-month deadline, could you come consult with us, please? Let's have a hearing. Let's have a conversation. There might have been bills and votes in Congress to say, we don't think this is an emergency, or to question whether that was appropriate. and take action. That hasn't happened. And, part of the reason that has not happened is because both our House of Representatives and our Senate are controlled by the same political party as the president. And so you've heard very little coming out of Congress asking for the oversight that Congress normally has over trade. What you have seen, so there hasn't been as much question on is this an appropriate emergency and is this power appropriately being applied from Congress? But you have seen action in the courts.
Yeah.
And so a number of state attorneys general from Democratic states have sued, saying that this is an inappropriate use of IEEPA, that broad tariffs like this were not envisioned and not appropriate under the law. You've seen a number of companies who have faced, economic damage from these tariffs and were, reliant on imports. I think it's important to remember that a lot of what the United States imports are goods to make other goods. So it's, businesses whose own operations, not just consumers, that are hurt by this. So a number of companies have also sued to say this is an inappropriate use of IEEPA, of the act, because tariffs are not an appropriate use under the law. 2 lower courts have agreed with those challenges. And now that case is going to the U.S. Supreme Court. Both the administration and those companies pushed the Supreme Court together to quickly hear the case, given its import,
it's
or how important
impact.
it is. And so the court agreed, and on November 5, we'll hear arguments in the case at the Supreme Court. Could have a ruling then by the end of the year. For the U.S. court system, that is lightning speed. And
Thank goodness it's not South African courts. It would have been another 15 years.
So, it will be interesting to see what the courts say. If the courts continue the ruling of the lower courts and these tariffs are deemed illegal, it's quite possible and anticipated that the tariffs collected thus far under IEEPA, so not the specific product tariffs, but those across-the-board reciprocal tariffs, would have to be refunded as well. It's a process that would likely take a very long time.
Yes.
But it would both, stop the continuation of those tariffs and spur a refund of tariffs collected.
Will this eventually go to Congress as well?
Well,
To rephrase that question, if the court says this is not right, it must be reversed, do they ever say over Congress? Can Congress...
Congress could change the law. Now, so it wouldn't go to Congress. The court has, in our system of checks and balances, right, it's really the courts who interpret the law as it is, right? And so the courts might say, this is an inappropriate use of the law, the administration can't continue this way, and the administration should comply. It would be more of a constitutional crisis if they chose to ignore the courts, right? Who's supposed to have the check in our government on that. And
can President Trump go over the courts or not?
No, I mean that's system of checks and balances.
The courts is the
that's sort of the last stop is the Supreme Court.
Okay.
But if Congress were to say, actually, we think this was envisioned under the law, or that tariffs should be included in this emergency economic powers, any member of Congress could introduce a bill saying, I want to amend IEEPA to explicitly include tariffs. There's a long process toward making that bill become the law, right, and getting the support for it. I think a more likely path is that the administration would look for other authorities either continuing to push forward with tariffs on specific products, to negotiate, bilaterally on some deals, but use other mechanisms to impose tariffs.
I think what somebody said to us, and in South Africa there's a political, what do you call it, analyst. They do a lot of polling, especially they did a lot of stuff in South Africa's elections and things over the last couple of years, and he also has a lot of dealings with the US. And he said it's very easy if South Africa complies to certain rules or requests from the US, because from what I understand and what's been said, is that the US wants to invest in South Africa. So if we apply to these requests, these things will just disappear. So it's almost like we want to give the money to you, but in order for us to do it, you need to comply to us. And this is like almost like a bilateral thing to get us to comply, or to get our government to comply. Could that be the case?
Well, I think I don't have any insider information
Yes,
into the
Yeah,
items that might be on the table
Obviously,
and requests from the U.S. to South Africa. But certainly what the imposition of these reciprocal tariffs has done is spurred a negotiation process with countries who were facing relatively high rates under that reciprocal calculation, which, to be clear, when that process was announced that the United States was going to require reciprocal tariffs of countries, the methodology that was promised was that the reciprocal tariffs that countries would face would be based on the tariffs that they charge the United States. And I think there is some feeling that, you know, when countries join the WTO and they put forward their tariff schedules, that the United States locked in very low tariff rates on products coming into the United States. Other countries kept significantly higher rates. And unlike what the promise of the WTO may have been, was to negotiate those barriers down over time, we haven't seen that progress. So there is some frustration, I think, on both sides of the political aisle that the United States has in the past continued to maintain a relatively open market and have not seen that push toward openness from others. And so part of what you're seeing in the US, I think, is part of that frustration, right? That we've had a relatively open posture and others have not. You know, these reciprocal tariffs that were going to be calculated, you know, country by country, we're going to try to reflect the tariffs you charge us or what we are going to charge you. The non-tariff barriers that you might apply, really restrictive licensing, overly burdensome food safety or plant health regulations.
Yes.
There would also be sort of a tariff value assigned to those. So
Obviously,
you
yeah.
would get this tariff figure that reflected the general openness of your market to us, and you know that's the tariff we would put back on your products. In reality, when those tariffs were announced, it was clear that the only factor determining the tariff rate your country received was the level of the trade imbalance or the trade deficit that the United States had with your country. And that fixation on trade deficits as being bad, as giving other countries ownership or control over the United States, has been something that the president has been focused on for quite some time. And so for those countries that got high rates, the United States said, we're going to negotiate 90 deals in 90 days with these, you know, countries to try and get those rates down. But the only way they can bring those tariffs rates down is to be more open to U.S. products or to make commitments to buy a certain amount of product, so bringing down the trade deficit, or investing in the United States. And so you've seen a handful of those deals with Japan, with South Korea, with the EU, and you have seen a focus on particular tariffs, so countries saying we'll charge zero tariffs on exports from the United States. In exchange, we want to see lower tariffs on autos and auto parts, on, you know, our agricultural goods, on other things that we ship to you. And a number of countries have said, and we will promise we'll buy this many $1 billion in agricultural or, you know, manufactured products, and we will invest this much money in the United States. And that's the transaction, right, that lowers that overall tariff burden. Will those, you know, if the reciprocal tariffs are struck down, will those deals persist? I think that's a really good question, right? Will countries be able to live up to these very large investment commitments and agreements with very little detail?
Yes,
Over what companies are going to make those investments or not? I mean, I think all of that sort of remains to be seen. And unlike a traditional trade agreement, which are thousands of pages long. We have yet to see much text on any of these agreements and exactly how they will be applied to specific products, over what timeline. There's no dispute settlement procedure for how you would adjudicate if one country is not living up to the agreement on one side or the other. It's sort of just the goodwill of countries to stay at the table or not after a certain period of time. So I think there's a lot left to be seen about what those bilateral, sort of those one-off deals are going to deliver in the long term.
One of the things that, in terms of the South African citrus industry, is that we've got access to the US, but we've only got access from certain provinces to the US because of the other provinces got citrus black spot. Yet the US are taking fruits from, I think it is Uruguay or Argentina, one of those that's got citrus black spot. They are taking it in. But one of the trade barriers was that we should take, in particular, pork shoulders, I think.
Yes, we need to
Import more pork shoulders from the US.
Yes.
But then again,
And chicken.
Yes. Well, chicken will find a mouth to go into in South Africa, but pork shoulders itself might not be something that it gets consumed. Now, and you mentioned it yesterday. When some of these things, will that reciprocal country be able to consume or absorb that volume that the US might be saying must go to them?
Right. I don't know the particulars of some of these deals, right? But certainly I spent a long time negotiating market access for various products when I was in government, and spent a long time working with my colleagues at the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and others to make sure that we also were practicing what we preached, right? And where there was good science, that we would open our market if we felt confident that plant health, for example, was being protected or maintained.
Yes.
And so, I'm not in a position to look at what South Africa has presented versus
Yes.
Uruguay and others who may all have citrus black spot, but who may have different conditions in terms of timing or eradication and control procedures and, incidence of disease, right? So our plant health experts would have to take that into account and decide when access comes.
Yeah, I was just making an example about that one particular thing that was
right. And I think those questions are being raised in the context of these negotiations, both for U.S. exports, but certainly I'm sure others are raising them to say, what about our access on the other side, right? And I think there's a frustration as an agricultural exporter in the United States, but also an important import destination. I think there's often frustration on both sides that the certifications and the ability to export and to deal with those plant health regulations and animal health that can be really sticky and lengthy. But what concerns me about trying to quickly make decisions about them in the context of these sort of one-off bilateral deals is that it can be tempting to kind of push the experts aside. But the next time there's an outbreak of black spot, or the next time there's an outbreak of disease in pork, what you want is to have the experts in both countries with a deep relationship and an understanding of why initial decisions were taken, so that you can quickly resolve them the next time. I think the more we politicize those decisions, the less we have kind of the well of understanding we're going to need to keep the trade relationship moving in the long term. So I don't know the status of that in particular. I think for the United States, of course, we're huge exporters of poultry and of pork.
Yes.
I don't know the status right now of pork exports into South Africa, and I don't know whether there's actually a position to say we want you to guarantee purchases of pork, or if what you're saying is we want South Africa to allow and certify that pork can come in. It may be both, right? Yes. But I think that's, to me, these purchase agreements get a little bit tricky because it's usually not the government who's doing the buying. And so when governments promise a certain level of purchases, is there demand for that purchase? Are there companies prepared to make that purchase? And if it's not in demand, is it the beginning of a long-term relationship, or is it sort of a one-off purchase that may not in the long term
Yes.
benefit the U.S. pork industry, right? And so
Or the country.
or the country,
Yes.
right? So, I always saw my job as a trade official to allow U.S. producers of whatever in agriculture to have the most opportunities to sell their product in the most possible forms, right? And to go and build those markets themselves. So whether it was a whole soybean or soybean meal or soybean oil or, feed for animals or whatever, if I was growing a soybean, there would be multiple opportunities for me to add value to my farm, right? As a soybean farmer, just as one example. So as many countries in as many forms as possible.
It makes sense because that money will be spent within the US.
Within the U.S. But forming the specific relationships, writing those contracts, that's not my job.
Yes.
It's to make it possible.
Yes.
And so these purchase agreements where governments say we're going to buy X, there still has to be a transaction between the private sector players there. And so turning those agreements into reality, we didn't see them materialize in the way that they were supposed to when we did the phase 1 deal with China in the last Trump administration. Those promises were not completely met. And in that case, you had, state-owned enterprises that the government could direct to make those purchases, and they still didn't happen at the level envisioned. Where you have, private sectors who will have to be doing the purchasing, there's yet another step of remove. And so, correctly identifying where it's a trade barrier that was preventing that and where there's still more work to do for supply and demand, that's a tricky enterprise.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So I would like to go back to specifically the status. You did a fantastic job of explaining how the trade barriers, the trade tariffs have been set, and how the Trump administration has made this happen, and how things could develop from there. But if you look at the snapshot now from a US perspective, it seems everything is pretty fluid at the moment still. Everything is still moving and changing. I know it's difficult to ask you to look down the road, but that's actually essentially what I'm asking you to do. What do you foresee things happening in the next year as far as what could happen?
Well, I think there are a few things that could happen that may change the current trajectory. One, of course, would be that the courts declare the use of IEEPA illegal. If those tariffs were to go away, I think the question is what authorities might be used or what measures might take their place, and where the focus of tariffs or other trade measures might go next, right? I think you are already seeing both broad use of Section 232, so these investigations into products whose import may have an impact on national security. Okay. That's our steel and aluminum tariffs that have gone into play, tariffs on autos and auto parts. There's investigations on polysilicon, on rare earth minerals, on, tariffs were announced today on furniture. And looking at lumber and lumber products, right? So furniture, on pharmaceuticals, so they're broad sectors that the administration is describing as sort of essential to the U.S. economy that are facing this competition from trade and are using this Section 32 investigations to then impose tariffs. I don't see that going away, right? And so continued investigations, perhaps additional sectors. What we saw with the steel and aluminum tariffs was that the first tariffs were imposed on steel and aluminum. But the list of products containing steel and aluminum has continued to grow as also being covered by the tariffs. You may see the same thing when it comes to copper or, autos also included, then auto parts. And, so the list of product coverage under those original tariff inclusions may continue to expand. But there are some forces in the other direction, right? We talked earlier about the fact that while these tariffs have been in place for a few months, that the impact is starting to be seen, but hasn't really been felt yet at the grocery store or the department store or whatever it might be for consumers. And because of the uncertainty about how these tariffs have been applied, if these negotiations were going to bring them all down and come to fruition, companies have worked really hard not to pass on the prices to consumers yet. You've seen a number of companies drawing down imports or inventories rather before taking on new imports to avoid raising costs. And you have seen that sharing of cost between the importer and the exporter, which you can do for a while, but at a certain point, business continuity might require prices to go up. So I think the pinch of those tariffs is going to start to be felt at household level much more in the coming months. So later on this fall, you're going to start to see that inventories are running out. Companies can only cover.
And it's coming up to holiday season.
Now, when it comes to imported product, and when these tariffs were coming, sort of companies could see them, there was a huge rush to import product before the tariffs took hold. So there's a question for me about which companies were able to kind of bring in that holiday, those holiday products before the tariffs bit to try and keep prices down. But it's agriculture that can't game that system, right?
Perishable products can't do that.
Perishable products cannot. And the grocery store and inflation on food has a lot of consumers get angry about that. Politicians listen to that. And so, it's the agriculture sector can't shut down the production line for a week until it waits to see what happened. If the fruit is ripe, you have to pick. If the soybeans are ready for harvest, you have to harvest them. And what are you going to do with them? So, I think the agriculture sector and food prices hitting at the same time as this reduction of inventories of other more durable goods, the inflationary pressure will start to be seen. There are already a couple of bills that have been introduced in the U.S. Congress. So even though Congress has broadly given the president a lot of leeway to exercise his trade policy, there first was a bill that was introduced with bipartisan support to remove coffee from the list of items that were subject to these reciprocal tariffs. Now, I'm all for it. I don't operate well without my cup of coffee.
I can imagine the coffee bill that Congress has got to spend.
Right, staying up all night. So, we like our coffee in the U.S., and it's one of those products we just don't grow. There's like a little pocket of coffee production in Hawaii, right? But certainly not going to provide the entire U.S. market. And so it was an illustration of the fact that we're dependent on imports for some things, and that's okay, but taxing them doesn't make a lot of sense. It's not going to somehow bolster U.S. industry. It's just going to drive up the food cost for everyday Americans. Another bill was recently introduced that would exempt all food products from these tariffs. Again, sort of making the point that one, particularly counter-seasonally, there are a number of things we need to import to create a healthy diet. And even though we have a very efficient and successful U.S. ag sector, on any given day, a lot of things may be imported, particularly in our winter, right?
Exactly.
But also that access to nutritious, safe, affordable food at affordable prices is important for human health, and it's critical that families are able to provide that, or that people are able to provide that for their families.
And they've actually had a big drive on that with what's his surname now again? JFK?
Yeah, with RFK Jr.
With RFK Jr.,
this Make America Healthy Again.
Exactly.
So it is interesting to me that it feels like our trade policy and, FDA and health policy are working at cross purposes here.
Yes.
Where you have RFK Jr., our Health and Human Services Secretary, saying the biggest cause of non-communicable disease is bad diet. and we need to be eating whole and fresh foods more than we're eating processed foods. But, particularly out of season, the more we put tariffs on those foods, the more they will be out of reach for the average person to eat every day. So I think some spotlight is being made that this Make America Healthy agenda could be, directly undermined by the imposition of these tariffs on food.
And there's a big ripple effect, like the butterfly effect. So yes, all these companies imported this massive inventory now for the holiday season before the tariffs. But if people can't afford to buy them because they've got to put food on the table, what are you going to do? The inventory sitting on a shelf is it's not money in your pocket.
No, that's absolutely right. And I think sort of which goods are hit and at what level, particularly households with lower income, right? How do they behave at the holidays? How does the inflation on staples affect their purchasing power for other things that are more discretionary, right? And I think part of that remains to be seen, how that sort of settles out, if it is, where those 10% start to bite. We're here at a blueberry conference together. Blueberries are nutritious. They're always in my refrigerator. My family, I think, keeps the blueberry industry alive. But
You're not alone.
Yes. But they are considered a bit of a luxury. Berries are still a bit of a special occasion fruit, I guess, a little separately from apples or bananas or foods that kind of more go in that staples basket. Will a 10% tariff on berries from Peru sink blueberry imports? Maybe not. But a 10% tariff on everything may start to bite on those things a little bit harder than if that 10% tariff on blueberries was happening in isolation. I think it will be interesting to see how that shakes out in consumer behavior and the choices that they have to make. But because these tariffs are so broad, when everything, it's your blueberries and your T-shirts and, the things that you're bringing in, where it starts to pinch. I think everyone's watching those inflation numbers.
Very interesting. You mentioned something before we started chatting, which I think is also, it's a little bit off the specific topic of tariffs. But you mentioned that the new administration has seen quite a reduction of people working in the agricultural sector in the US. It would be interesting to hear a little bit about that from you, please.
Sure. As part of the this administration undertook this or created this Department of Government Efficiency.
Yes.
Famously.
Doge.
Yes, Doge and Elon Musk, our South African, was at the head of it. And what we have seen are massive reductions in force of the U.S. Civil Service and the cancellation of a number of different government programs that were operating within our federal departments. I think the Partnership for Public Service, a nonprofit in the U.S. that looks at civil service and public service jobs, is trying to figure out exactly how many of those civil servants have either taken these buyouts or been fired from their jobs. But we're talking hundreds of thousands of individuals. And what that has done are a couple of things. You've also seen massive disinvestment in government research, the cancellation in a number of grants to universities, or the discontinuation of research programs and trials at the National Institutes of Health, for example. And then, just last week, it was announced that the United States is no longer going to collect its National Food Insecurity Survey, looking at food insecurity and hunger in American households, which is the basis for a lot of programs around school feeding and access to SNAP benefits and other programs in the U.S. There are questions being raised about whether the United States will continue to participate in these international organizations that provide research and data. Climate modeling, will the United States continue to conduct that? And a lot of that research, that market data, the expertise, the scientists that work for the U.S. government who may no longer be in their jobs, but who provide that forecasting, modeling, and analysis, it's unclear whether that the same breadth and depth of analysis will be there, either for the United States and the private sector and academia and the public sector to use as the basis for its work, but the rest of the world as well. Will we continue to do reports on, every agricultural sector with the same frequency and accuracy as we used to provide before? And it's a big question. What our Department of Agriculture or Departments of Health and Human Services will look like in terms of that investment in research, analysis, and modeling.
That's huge.
Yeah.
Just for me in South Africa, the little third world country at the tip of Africa, my first port of call when I do research is to go and look at the USDA reports, go and look at the USDA modeling, and start there.
Yeah.
So
The
it's a
world
benchmark.
the world still looks up to the US in all aspects.
So to many people in the agricultural sector, the research that's put out by the US is a benchmark to start from.
Yes.
So what you've just said is kind of worrying.
Yeah.
So we'll keep an eye on that and see where it goes.
I've got two questions before we wrap it up. Is that you as an American citizen, take off your government hat and everything. Have you felt in your household pressure from these things, from these tariffs, or have you seen exponential cost increases in your shopping basket?
Not yet. And not that I have noticed. Now, I am not a low-income American, right? And so I have not started to see that pinch, not sitting down to say I have exactly this much for groceries, and I'm fortunate in that way. And again, I think on a lot of other consumer goods or more durable goods, the length of time for those tariffs to start hitting hasn't hit yet. You definitely are seeing price increases on things like chocolate or coffee. Those have been reported because we aren't growing them. And you have seen tariffs combined with challenging weather and other things hitting that sector, right? And so you've seen complaints or people noticing that, your cup of coffee prices have gone up. Certainly chocolate in the past couple of years have gone up because of supplies, even more so because of tariffs. But again, I think that is coming. And I think you are seeing people talk about, and one place you're seeing it is in cars.
Yes.
And, tax credits for EVs have gone away. This administration is not focused on energy efficiency and on renewables. And so you've seen tax credits go away, but also, concerns about the price of cars with tariffs on autos and auto parts. So you've seen a lot of articles, tips for people on planning. If you're going to buy a car, you needed to buy it, right before those tariffs started to hit. So some of the durable goods where those tariffs really are adding up, you see people really planning around them or saying, I may delay this purchase for as long as possible to see whether these tariffs are going to persist. But it hasn't significantly changed my lifestyle. I think those on the lower end of the income spectrum are starting to get quite worried.
Then, my last official question is, how has South Africa been for you? What did you expect before you came here, and how has it been since? Because we've had a lot of bad publicity in the U.S. media recently.
Yes, I think that's right. It's not my first time to South Africa. So it is, however, my first time in the city of Cape Town. I've attended some meetings and other conferences outside of the city. So far, it's been great, but it's only been about 24 hours. So I haven't had a lot of time to explore. In my experience, the hospitality in South Africa has always been top-notch. The first time I came was for Rio Plus 10. I was part of the U.S. negotiating team when South Africa hosted the Earth Summit then, and that was obviously huge and momentous, the first time that the continent had hosted a UN conference of that scale. And then, South Africa rolled out the red carpet, did a fantastic job hosting that meeting. And I think, we were in the fanciest neighborhood of Johannesburg, right, with the convention center and the facilities there. And it was amazing to see how vibrant the economy is. I think the conception that the U.S. has of South Africa is decades behind and the African continent, where the continent really is. And, I was really struck by, during the conference yesterday, the maps on sort of population growth and how many countries have reached zero or even negative growth, but you see Africa and the growth there, we would be silly to continue to ignore a continent that is growing so quickly in population, in income, in, the opportunity for investment is huge. And the depth of the sort of conversation about driving South African agriculture forward has been really interesting to hear. So, positive impression so far.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Good to hear. One tends to get bogged down with all the problems and so on, but to get some positive feedback from someone from outside is always a pleasure. Yeah. So thank you. Last point on the agenda.
Sure.
We have a tradition, and that is that someone from one of our previous guests leaves a random question for the next guest. And so this is you're up next.
And
with the
they don't know
question.
who it's going to be for, and we'll tell you afterwards.
Okay.
This one. And it's a personal question. In the next year, what would your biggest contribution be to the agricultural sector?
Oh, goodness.
Not a small one.
That is
no pressure.
Big question. What would my biggest contribution be?
Or what would you like your biggest contribution?
I think that's easier.
Well, my career has been largely at that intersection of agriculture and trade, but I am a farm girl from the middle of Nebraska. And my family's farm was one of the first farms to convert to organic agriculture back in the 70s.
Wow.
And so I am, now that I've left government and I'm thinking about sort of the future of agriculture and even my family's business, I'm thinking a lot about the supply chain and the incentives that farmers need to really invest in more regenerative practices. And so over the next year, I'm trying to figure out where I can best sort of bring that market knowledge and information along with the understanding of the investment, what we were talking about before on how change takes time in agriculture, right? It's not manufacturing widgets, to really help catalyze that investment and encourage more and more farmers to be able to adopt those more regenerative methods. So I'm in kind of a career exploration phase, and I hope a year from now I've really kind of figured out how to harness that energy toward that end.
Oh, wow.
That's very exciting. Well, you've manifested it now. So
now I said it out loud. I have to do it.
There you go. That's really exciting.
So, yeah.
Well, Darci, thank you so much for joining us. It's been incredibly insightful and really, really appreciate your time.
Yes.
Well, I'm so glad to have met you and hope the conversation is helpful. I've enjoyed it very much.
And enjoy Cape Town for the rest of the time that you are here.
I will.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.